against Russian despotism again. And for the record, at the time, of course, we're talking pre-revolution. So obviously, not exactly the Russia that you know as the USSR. And the current state of Russian affairs also does not reflect any kind of socialist sentiment. Much to consider. Much to consider about how history repeats itself. But sometimes, I guess, not the good parts.
Our task is to ward off this danger, to safeguard the civilization and independence of our own country. We do not leave the fatherland in the lurch in the hour of danger. After the majority of the party had voted for the war, it adopted the policy of Burgfriedenspolitik, castle peace politics in English, a social truce, which means that for the time being, for the sake of the fatherland, the party and the affiliated unions would not criticize the government or call for strikes. This term is still in use today in German-speaking countries to refer to class collaborationism of social democratic parties or other nominally left organizations. It was not until months later, against the pressure of the entire ruling class and the public opinion it dominated, amid a climate when any opposition to the war would earn you accusations of treason and allegiance to Tsarist Russia, when Karl Liebknecht defied party discipline and proclaimed in public his opposition to the war by voting as the only social democrat in the Reichstag against the war credits on December 2nd. He spoke, quote, "I am voting against the war credits bill today for the following reasons. This war, which none of the peoples involved desired, was not started for the benefit of the German or of any other people. It is an imperialist war, a war for capitalist domination of the world markets and for the political domination of the important countries in the interests of industrial and financial capitalism. The slogan against Tsarism is being used, just as the French and British slogan against militarism, to mobilize the noble sentiments, the revolutionary traditions and the hopes of the people for the national hatred of other peoples." This show of courage would make Liebknecht one of the symbols of the anti-war movement. He gave the anti-war voices a platform.
Classic. It seems like you want Russian barbarism to take root in the entirety of beautiful Europe, which is so much better than that sort of disgusting orc-like behavior. Wow. You want a ceasefire, dude? It's appeasement. Literally.
Around which war opponents could rally and feel supported by at least some force within politics. Other prominent members of the revolutionary left voiced their opposition to the war, such as Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, and Franz Mehring. Several SPD members were purged from their positions after showing opposition to the war. Luxemburg soon landed in prison. Liebknecht was conscripted to the war despite being older than 40, and then later landed in prison as well. The general mood changed soon, however. Soldiers came back with stories about the war's horrors. Enthusiasm for the war began to wane. Anti-war protests increased rapidly. The SPD could have easily made use of this energy to take a critical stand against the war which was dragging on and on. All pretense about self-defense became empty and laughable. By now it was clear to most that the German Empire was aiming at expanding its power. At the start of the war, state and military leaders of the belligerent powers estimated the war would be over within months. The first German Chief of Staff, Schlieffen, said that a long war was inconceivable. As the armies got bogged down in the trenches, it wasn't only the soldiers that had to suffer and die for their imperialists. The whole economy needed to be milked to run the war machine. Living standards were hit immediately. Food supply crashed due to people from agriculture being conscripted or because of the blockade. The caloric value of the weekly diet fell to half of what a person needed on average to survive. People worked within a war economy, with mass production ramping up, bringing suffering workers closer together. So while the war crushed many links of organized labor, in a way it created conditions for more explosive organization. On May 1st, Karl Liebknecht addressed the May Day rally by shouting, "Down with the war, down with the government," before being taken into custody and receiving a 4-year sentence, landing again in prison. The 1 million strong SPD was the dominant power contesting the Prussian state for legitimacy. It was the time to mobilize the masses against the state. But to the revolutionary left, it was clear that German social democracy had abandoned Marxism long ago. Lenin called the actions of the SPD a sheer betrayal of socialism. It's not that the party could have prevented the war by adopting other positions. It was their abandoning of the class stand to be on the side of the working class in the face of imperialist war. The workers' parties did not oppose the government's criminal conduct, but called upon the working class to identify its position with that of the imperialist governments. The leaders of the International committed an act of treachery against socialism by voting for war credits, by reiterating the chauvinist slogans of the bourgeoisie of their own countries, by by justifying
Yep.
and defending the war by joining the bourgeois governments of the belligerent countries, and so on and so forth. The responsibility for thus disgracing socialism falls primarily on the German Social Democrats, who were the strongest and most influential party in the Second International. The Second International was an organization of various socialist parties around the world. Before the outbreak of the World War in 1912, after tensions were increasing everywhere, leading already to the Balkan Wars or the Italo-Turkish War, the Second International agreed on a declaration in the Swiss city of Basel, basing itself on two famous paragraphs of the earlier Stuttgart.
They're looking at this entirely wrong. Thinking about a potential future where socialism won in Germany, when in fact they should have implemented socialism immediately in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, and instead of having a bourgeois, liberal, post-colonial state, the Turkish Republic, they could have had a socialist state. And then Turkey wouldn't be a part of NATO. The world would be the socialist Ottoman Republic. Would have completely dismantled the bourgeois capitalist interests.
Resolution, which were mostly the work of Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin, it stated, quote, "If war is declared, the working classes in the countries affected, as well as their parliamentary representatives, have the duty to mobilize their forces to prevent hostilities from breaking out, with the support of the coordinating activity of the International Bureau, by applying those means which will seem the most effective to them, means which evidently will vary according to the more or less aggravated turn which the class struggle may take, and in relation to the general political situation. If, in spite of their efforts, war should break out, their duty is to struggle actively for a speedy end to the fighting, and to make every effort to use the economic and political crisis which the war causes to rouse the people, and in this way to speed up the abolition of the rule of the capitalist class." The breaking of most European socialist parties with this resolution had a far-reaching historical significance. According to Lenin, quote,
Why didn't the Turkish socialism timeline happen? One, bourgeois revolution. Two, NATO. American involvement. Turkey's geopolitical position created a phenomenal opportunity for it to be a direct military base against the USSR. That's where the Cuban Missile Crisis started as well. We had our own version of Gladio happening in Turkey at the time, where America went in, took like some of the worst, most hyper nationalist, the ultra nationalist fascists in Turkey, and beefed them up, offered them support. They spent every waking moment killing commies in Turkey and destroying any kind of left sentiment.
"This collapse has been mainly caused by the actual prevalence in it of petty bourgeois opportunism, the bourgeois nature and the danger of which have long been indicated by the finest representatives of the revolutionary proletariat of all countries. This opportunism was evident before the outbreak of the war through the emphasis on the legalist, reformist, and parliamentary approach, and class collaboration. The backing of the imperialist efforts was only the crowning of this trend towards resignation and compromise with the capitalists."
Yeah, the term deep state was invented in Turkey. Derin devlet. Like literally. It is a term that originates from Turkish terminology.
System. Quote, "Opportunism was engendered in the course of decades by these special features in the period of the development of capitalism, when the comparatively peaceful and cultured life of a stratum of privileged workmen bourgeoisified them, gave them crumbs from the table of their national capitalists, and isolated them from the suffering, misery, and revolutionary temper of the impoverished and ruined masses. The imperialist war is the direct continuation and culmination of this state of affairs, because this is a war for the privileges of the great power nations, for the repartition of colonies and domination over other nations." Lenin said that this World War was the beginning of a new epoch, in which the aim of the working class was to struggle for power. Quote, "The conversion of the present imperialist war into a civil war is the only correct proletarian slogan. one that follows from the experience of the Paris Commune and outlined in the Basel Resolution. It has been dictated by all the conditions of an imperialist war between highly developed bourgeois countries. One must be blind not to see bourgeois and petty bourgeois influence on the proletariat as the main and fundamental cause of the International's disgrace and collapse in 1914. Lenin was accused.
You have a lot of influence over the Western left. Do you plan on facilitating another communist international, or do you see another approach? Yeah. You're right, man. I'm going to do another international. Dude, take off the fucking horse blinders. I'm literally a Twitch streamer, okay? That is the most nutty thing I've ever heard. Oh my God. That's awesome. Oh.
Of causing the schism in the socialist movement. But from Lenin's point of view, it was not him and the other Bolsheviks trying to split the left by defending Marxism and rejecting liberalism. It was the opportunists who reject Marxism and defend liberalism. This is a common narrative that is still deployed against revolutionaries, that they are dogmatists, or that they are not pragmatic by clinging on to principles. Well, if you look at the SPD today, or other examples of revisionism, which are fully immersed in the imperialist system, you see that Marxists might have very good reasons to struggle for the correct political positions. There was another narrative that was put forward to defeat and even co-opt the Marxist standpoint. As the proletarian internationalist and the class struggle perspective grew, the ruling classes of Germany sought to combat it with the probably most effective bourgeois counter-narrative, nationalism. The goal was to reconcile the working class with the German Reich, to dilute class struggle by putting all members of a nation in the same team. Prominent apostles, such as
And that shit worked real fucking good.
Stöcker, sought to
this day
integrate the idea of the proletariat as part of the national community. Friedrich Naumann, a racist pastor and liberal politician, who later co-founded the German Democratic Party, sought to combine non-Marxist socialism with nationalism and liberalism, proposing social reform as a means to prevent class struggle. And of course, we know who later picked up the idea of National Socialism and how nationalism served to dilute the class struggle perspective then as well. But this will be the topic of another video that is coming soon.
This is why MAGA communism is a laughable concept in general. Like any kind of Nazbol sentiment, any kind of like national Bolshevism, any kind of sentiment that like brings nationalism into the equation immediately destroys any revolutionary aspect in the direction of socialism. You just can't do that. That's not a real thing. Okay? It's not. It is inherently reactionary. It's inherently counterproductive. It is inherently oxymoronic. It's just it's not dialectical. It's not materialist. It's not, well, I wouldn't say it's not dialectical. I guess it's not materialist at all. The concept of a nation state and nationalism as an extension of that concept is inherently not materialist. It's completely spiritual. It's ideological. You just made it up. You're like, oh yeah, me and all my neighbors, like we all, the people living in this fucking plot of land that we designed as a state are all, we're all united on our own values, on our own principles, on our shared principles. Is yet another way to mystify class struggle. In America, we don't really do it that much because I fear that we have better mechanisms of control. But anyway, let's continue.
In fact, already at this point, anti-Semitism as well served as a means to direct the anger of the petty bourgeoisie away from big capital, who was crushing it, to a supposed Jewish elite in control of working class organizations. August Bebel called this tendency the socialism of fools. But you can argue that the SPD was part of this nationalistic socialist trend as well, as they linked the well-being of the German working class to the success of German imperialism, not to the success of the international proletariat against the international bourgeoisie. You can see how at the time the word socialism was quite popular, so various movements used it opportunistically to draw in working class support. Unfortunately, this reactionary trend that claims socialism is still a phenomenon today. As the war dragged on, it became more and more obvious to everyone what the revolutionary left had already said at the beginning, that this war does not serve the people in any way. In December 1916, 20 SDP deputies voted along with Liebknecht against further war credits. Liebknecht was painted as a purist, an adventurist, an idealist at the outbreak of the war. Now, his stance was adopted by a larger and larger section of the SPD. Eventually, 40% of the socialist deputies opposed the war. However, as the Vorwärts pointed out, those who opposed the war represented more voters than the deputies who were pro-war, thus actually representing the majority. In January 1917, the SPD under Ebert expelled those who voted against the war, and these people went on to form the Independent Social Democratic Party, Unabhängige SPD in German, or USPD. The old SPD was now referred to as the Majority SPD, or MSPD. The USPD was a mixed group of different trends, united by their anti-war position. Among them were Eduard Bernstein and Karl Kautsky, who now opposed the war as well. They had supported it in the beginning. And members of the Spartacist group such as Luxemburg and Liebknecht, who for the time being refused to split from this party, as mentioned before. There would soon ensue a world historic event that would massively boost and inspire the anti-war movement and accelerate the end of the imperialist slaughter. One of the chief revolutionary theorists who opposed working-class support for the war and upheld the fight for socialism as the correct Marxist position went on to actually implement the Marxist ideas that the revolutionary left had argued for this whole time. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had seized power in St. Petersburg in November, or in October according to the old style of the calendar. Every German was soon to learn that the people from a country the German state represented as the quote, enemy number one, unquote, had been overthrown. Despite state censorship, the increasingly suffering and radicalizing working class had seen that revolution and an end to the war was possible. The German Minister for the Interior spoke of, quote, the intoxicating effect of the Russian Revolution. Social Democrat member of the Reichstag, Hugo Haase, warned the government, quote, does the Chancellor want the German masses to end up speaking Russian? Spartacist Fritz Heckert said, the German proletariat must draw the lessons of the Russian Revolution and take their own destiny in hand. This sentiment was reflected by the German working class, and the German state tried as hard as they could to defuse the explosive potential the October Revolution had brought with it. The argument of national defense made by the SPD sounded even emptier after the victory of the Bolsheviks. They could no longer claim that Russian tyranny presented a danger. The leadership of the USPD praised the revolution, quote, the working class has taken
which is infinitely scarier. In the eyes of the capital owners, this presented an infinitely scarier alternative because Tsarist Russia can be dealt with. You can use it as a perfect enemy. But all of a sudden, a better solution is possible. Holy shit. You don't want the fucking peasants to learn about that. You don't want the peasants to look at a country that can lead by example. It's terrifying.
Political power in Russia. This is an event of world significance. Never has the working class faced such an important task as this. 2 days later, in the same newspaper, it said, quote, we, German workers, are with all our hearts with our Russian comrades in struggle in these days. They are also fighting for our cause. They are the vanguard of humanity, the vanguard of peace. In truth, however, the USPD was split on the new Soviet government. Most prominently, it was Bernstein and Kautsky that derided the revolution. Kautsky, who by now wasn't exactly close friends with Lenin, concluded that the revolution would end in chaos, and it is supposedly against democratic principles. Lenin prominently countered Kautsky's critique in the Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Quote, the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a question of the relation of the proletarian state to the bourgeois state, of proletarian democracy to bourgeois democracy. One would think that this is as plain as a pikestaff, but Kautsky, like a schoolmaster who has become as dry as dust from quoting the same old textbooks on history, persistently turns his back on the 20th century and his face to the 18th century, and for the 100th time, in a number of paragraphs, in an incredibly tedious fashion, choose the old cud over the relation of bourgeois democracy to absolutism and medievalism. He wrote that his analysis is, quote, such an awful theoretical muddle, such a complete renunciation of Marxism, that Kautsky, it must be confessed, has far excelled Bernstein. Lenin is criticizing Kautsky's misunderstanding of the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which emphasizes the class character of the state when compared to the liberal concept of democracy, which conceals it. It refers to workers, so the majority, being in power in contrast to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the minority, what we have now. The Bolsheviks saw the Russian Revolution merely as the first stage of a worldwide revolution. The Soviet government used every means possible to spread it in all countries.
Remember, guys, America's so fucking foundationally busted that the majority here unironically complain about the tyranny of majority. The tyranny of majority is a principle that Americans genuinely think is bad. Without even a shred of examination, we simultaneously claim we love democracy and say we hate tyranny of majority. Brother, the tyranny of majority is democracy. Capitalism, or a capital liberal democracy, is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Capital owners dictate what happens. A dictatorship of the proletariat, on the other hand, would be a democracy, a real democracy.
They even used the German-Russian peace negotiations at Brest-Litovsk on the 26th of November as a platform to spread the revolutionary message, and in particular to address the German workers and soldiers. Karl Liebknecht wrote from his prison cell, quote, "Thanks to the Russian delegates, Brest has become a revolutionary tribune. It has denounced the Central European powers, the lies and the hypocrisy of Germany. With the help of many social democrats, sympathizers of the October Revolution would spread thousands of leaflets in Germany to agitate for the revolution. The German military leaders exploited the Russian rush for peace and negotiated a peace settlement heavily in favor of the German Reich. The agitation for strikes and revolution by the Bolshevik delegation was heard, and on January 14th, a major strike broke out in Budapest and soon all over Austria and Hungary. It was estimated that 250,000 workers were on strike in Vienna alone, and thus began what historian Franz Borkenau at the time called, without exaggeration, quote, the greatest revolutionary movement of properly proletarian origin which the modern world has.
When liberals now look back at the German Marxist movement at the time and the trade unionist movement at the time in general and say the commies went too far and that's why a lot of people were scared and aligned with the fascists, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about revolutionary sentiment being expressed, revolutionary action being engaged with, and how this created firm and committed opposition from the capital owners who saw fascism as a vehicle for stability, or rather the maintenance of the pre-existing hierarchies.
Scene. The Spartacus League put out leaflets saying, quote, the Viennese workers elected councils on the Russian model, unquote, and proclaiming a general strike. About 500,000 workers went on strike all over Germany for several.
What is the correct response to that? I disagree with the premise of the tyranny of majority, but I don't know how to refute it. What do you mean? It's just called democracy. Do you like democracy? Americans think they like theoretical democracy. The question is, if there's no tyranny of majority, you know what you have? A tyranny of minority, which is what we currently have. A tyranny of minority is not a democracy at all, but instead something different, an oligarchy.
Days. Soldiers began to understand they didn't give their lives to defend Germany while the officers sat idle, sending them to their useless deaths. Sailors in northern Germany got organized and undertook various protest actions. The movement eventually failed under the violence of the military might, and its leaders were executed. The others received multiple years of hard labor each. The sailors had learned an important lesson: that you can take on the state's military machine with non-political peaceful protests. The main problem with the strikes was that there was no revolutionary organization guiding it towards revolutionary aims. Leo Jogiches wrote they, quote, did not know what to do with the revolutionary energy. Most crucially, there was no independent revolutionary party to undermine the confusion intentionally caused by the right-wing Social Democrats to diffuse the anger of the masses. Nobody could, at that point, openly declare their opposition to the strike movement without losing credibility among the masses. So the liberal opportunists do what they can do best. They co-opt the movement and try to suffocate it from within. The USPD was definitely not that revolutionary.
Even like Black Lives Matter, which wasn't necessarily revolutionary, nor was it socialist, was susceptible to the similar co-optation which occurred under the Trump administration.
Organization. It was led mostly by centrists who tried to distance themselves from the Spartacist slogan, the enemy is at home, peace through socialist revolution. They advised against mutiny or other seditious acts. The prominent SPD leaders declared their superficial support for the strike and managed to gain leading position in the action committees of the strike, against lots of opposition with one goal. As Friedrich Ebert later explained, quote, I joined the strike leadership with the clear intention of bringing the strike to a speedy end to prevent damage to the country. His party colleague Schneiderman and future Chancellor of Germany said, quote, if we had not joined the strike committee, law and order would not now exist here. The state knew very well who their enemy was and who wasn't. For instance, following a meeting that was banned by the state, left socialist Wilhelm Dittmann got a 4-year prison sentence while Ebert and co. were left untouched. Ebert said in a speech in that meeting, quote, it is the duty of workers to back up their brothers and fathers at the front and to manufacture the best arms. Victory is the dearest goal of all Germans. The Social Democrats did their absolute best to de-radicalize the strike movement. They sought to mediate with the government, maintaining that the strikers had merely economic demands, not political ones, which of course wasn't true. The strike was eventually smashed. Jogiches summed it up as follows, quote, because they could not imagine the strike wave as more than a simple protest movement, the committee, under the influence of the Reichstag deputies, tried to enter into negotiations with the government, instead of refusing all negotiations and directing the energy of the masses. Only a few weeks after the German High Command had been talking about victory, it became clear to them that they were sure to lose after a failed offensive on the Western Front in the summer of 1918. They now acknowledged, after seeing the massive strikes and protests, that the whole country was about to collapse. The only way to ensure stability was to negotiate for peace immediately and to liberalize the government in order to prevent a total breakdown. The leadership of the Prussian military suggested to the Kaiser that there was no choice but to bring the SPD into the government. Secretary of State Hintze famously said, quote, it is necessary to prevent an upheaval from below by a revolution from above. The MSPD was of course in full agreement with demanding the emperor's resignation. They wanted to gain the initiative over the revolutionaries whose support was rapidly growing.
No, I didn't say anything disparaging about Linux. I love Linux.
But the emperor refused and settled in the headquarters of the German army in Spa, in Belgium. The Kaiser's liberal-leaning cousin, Prince Max von Baden, was chosen as the chancellor, and concessions to the German workers were determined. Philipp Schneiderman of the SPD was among the politicians who were now let into the government and conduct the so-called October reforms to liberalize the government and negotiate a peace deal with US President Woodrow Wilson. All with one goal, to preserve the monarchy. Part of this maneuver was to be able to shift blame for the loss of the war on the Social Democrats in order to save any legitimacy that was left for the monarchy. Friedrich Ebert was of course totally okay with this. His ascension to state power was too close to refuse it. In a meeting of party leadership, he warned, quote, if we don't come to some understanding with the bourgeois parties and the government, then we will have to let events take their own course. Then we will be resorting to revolutionary tactics. A similar development would take place to that experienced in Russia. Part of the concessions to the working class was the releasing of Karl Liebknecht from prison, but all those maneuvers were not enough to calm the anger of the masses and to defeat the specter of revolution. The High Command was frustrated in their efforts for an immediate peace. The French imperialists were determined to grab as much territory as possible, just as the Germans did with the Soviet Union a year earlier. In a desperate attempt to defend as many holdings as possible, the Germans sent out troops to fight lost battles. But the sailors understood that the leadership was to send them to unnecessary and certain death. One sailor told his father, quote, we all felt this would be our last voyage, and so we instinctively refused to follow orders. And they did, and were immediately arrested. Thousands of sailors, joined by the port's workers, went out to protests at the arrests in Kiel. 9 were killed after clashes with government loyalists, but the movement had learned from their past mistakes and refused to protest peacefully, so they fired at the patrols and managed to force them to retreat. And thus began the German Revolution. Thank you for watching part 1. In the next part, we'll talk about and analyze the events of the German Revolution, including how Social Democrats crushed it with the help of proto-fascist forces, and we're gonna cover the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And we're gonna try to draw important lessons from this revolution for future organizing. So make sure to subscribe to not miss part 2, and I'll see you soon. Auf Wiedersehen.
Great video. I can't wait to watch the second part of it. I almost want to watch just like the foundation of like German paramilitaries, because it's very important. I mean, this establishes the basis of like how there's a reactionary heel turn from Social Democrats that inevitably sick their sights on what they consider to be much more threatening to the comfortable positions that they've created for themselves. The reason why I always stress this, like whenever people come in here and chirp about like the conditions that made way for Nazi Germany's rise, it is objectively ahistorical when people claim, like when people see the KPD and the German socialist movement and put the blame on them. Liberals who choose to put the blame on the German socialist movement are ironically doing the same fucking, like they're revisiting the same kind of fascist capitulations that literally happened back then. So in a way, they are saying like, no, as a liberal, I'm gonna turn into a Nazi soon. Like, you better fucking shut this down. It's so funny how a modern version of this sentiment is very much expressed, and we do laugh about it regularly. The whole like, oh, the left got too woke for me, so I fucking changed my entire worldview. You know what I mean? The left got too woke for me, which is why I no longer believe in like climate change. And actually personally think that like, I decided I am a Nazi now.
Welcome back, and thank you for the amazing feedback on part 1, which you should check out if you want to fully understand the historical context of the betrayal of the German Revolution, since we look at the development of the important political forces, their representatives, and how those relate to the development of capitalism. So in case you are confused about some names that I use here, you'll likely find an introduction of those organizations or personalities in the first part. So, los geht's. After the refusal of the sailors to be sent to their certain death by the high command of the German Reich, the key...
Dude, if this guy fucking complains about the existence of the Marxist-Leninist vanguard, I literally, I'm gonna lose my fucking mind. Read more Lenin. He is not clear on it, on why he says it's necessary. Can you please explain why Lenin was a tyranny of the few, i.e. vanguard tyranny, please? Yes, dude, vanguard tyranny. Violence sometimes is a necessity to overthrow, and it was a necessity to overthrow the Tsar. Okay, that's it. There is no political system. There is no political system that does not have violence in it, whether it's structural violence or direct violence or state violence. Okay, I don't understand. I don't understand how you think that hugs and kisses are going to magically cause any kind of monarchy to perish. What is that chatter pros are? No, he's probably fucking an infantile, disordered left com. That's it. That's what it is, most likely. No, through just like no disrespect to the Netzerei Karta, but just like the Messiah is going to magically give the Jews a nation state. He's going to come back, and capitalism is going to succumb to its own fucking. All the left com groups are pro-Lenin. Okay. He's an anarchist. I don't know. I don't know what he is.
The uprising began on November 3rd, 1918.
He's an anarcho-syndicalist. I don't know. I don't know what he is.
It was the beginning of the end for the German monarchy. But there was something bigger at play here. It was the very stability of German capitalism. By now, the revolting workers and soldiers understood very well who they were sent to death for. According to a report that was sent to the naval headquarters, the sailors were singing, quote, "We struggle not for Germany's honor. We struggle only for millionaires." They were saluting another with, "Long live Liebknecht." All attempts to suppress the Kiel uprising failed. The sailors disarmed their officers, armed themselves and raised the red flag on the ships and factories, freed their comrades from prison and occupied public buildings. Mass meetings composed of tens of thousands of people were held and sailors and workers' councils were formed, just like they had formed before the October Revolution in Russia. On November 4th, Kiel belonged to the councils. An increasing number of soldiers and workers showed their solidarity and joined, with many sailors leaving Kiel and carrying the uprising to all parts of the country. Virtually every town in Germany followed a similar pattern like the one in Kiel. The councils became the authority in the towns. In Hamburg, the biggest city in the north, a workers' and soldiers' council formed, and Paul Fröhlich of the International Communists of Germany led a group of armed soldiers to take over the daily paper Hamburger Echo to create an outlet for the council named Rote Fahne, Red Flag in English, which proclaimed, quote, "This is the beginning of the German Revolution, of the World Revolution. Hail the most powerful action of the World Revolution. Long live socialism. Long live the German Workers' Republic. Long live World Bolshevism." Within a few days, all major cities of the German Reich were under the control of revolutionary workers and soldiers' councils. It is really quite incredible how, within a short time, a revolutionary situation can unfold this quickly all over a country, shattering all the theories of many self-proclaimed Marxists about the seeming stability of capitalism, and they're shifting the question of revolution far into an indefinite future. Quote, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen," Lenin said in 1917. Even in conservative Bavaria, soldiers joined with the workers to occupy all strategic points, such as railroads, telephone offices, or government agencies. On November 8th, the People's Republic of Bavaria was formed, thus ending the Bismarckian system. For a long time, bourgeois historians refused to call this immense upheaval a revolution. They referred to it as a chaotic period, a period of disorder and mutiny. But what had happened was, in fact, a real revolution. The very fabric of the social and economic system was shattered and replaced with something else. The masses embraced the councils over monarchic and bourgeois institutions. What are those councils exactly, and why are they so important for workers' power? Karl Marx had written about them in his analysis of the Paris Commune. Quote, "The Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. The majority of its members were naturally working men, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body, executive and legislative at the same time. The councils were a more democratic alternative, not only to monarchy, but also to the parliamentary system. In contrast to bourgeois democracy, in which all economic power is in the hands of a small minority of capitalists, the councils were precisely an organ for democratic control of the economy by the workers themselves. They enabled millions of people to achieve an unprecedented degree of self-determination over their lives. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats were doing their best to ward off the revolution by pushing the Kaiser to abdicate. Friedrich Ebert told Prince Max, quote, "Unless the Kaiser abdicates, a revolution is inevitable. But I will have none of it. I hate it like sin." The revolution could no longer be defeated. It had to be stifled. But time was running out. People's power was being established everywhere. But the most important city had not fallen yet. In Berlin, the independent Social Democrats were arguing with the Spartakists and the revolutionary shop stewards about how to unleash the revolution in the most crucial city. The revolutionary left was in favor of a mass strike, but the meeting turned it down, chiefly by USPD leader Hugo Haase, who still believed in unity with the SPD. He smeared the Kiel uprising as an impulsive explosion. Berlin was the most crucial city because it was here where state repression was strongest. The police crushed a meeting to celebrate the anniversary of the Russian Revolution on November 7th and gained control of all important streets and public buildings. But Karl Liebknecht had
I'm not even chewing my nails right now. Shut the fuck up. I'm using a toothpick. Jesus Christ, y'all are so fucking annoying. I will chew my nails as much as I want. Suck my dick.
enough of the waiting and discussing with the cowardly USPD leaders and issued a leaflet calling for revolution. He was supported by the revolutionary shop stewards, the Spartakists, and many USPD members, frustrated with the appeasement of...
Wait, we interrupt this broadcast because there's a new Abu Ubaidah statement released. Apparently, Hamas actually captured more IDF soldiers. Where is it? Do you have a link? I want to see it. Hamas is claiming that a significant ambush against the IDF in the tunnels under the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza involved the killing of IDF soldiers and seizing their gear, and also the capture of at least one Israeli soldier. I can't show you the video, obviously, because it's very fucking graphic. I can't tell if he's alive and is the Israeli soldier that they captured, or if it's one of the dead Israeli soldiers, but they're dragging a dude inside of a tunnel system, it seems. I can't say I have much sympathy for the IDF. No, I don't have any sympathy for the IDF. I'm simply relaying what they're saying they did. Isn't that a war crime? Wait, what? You think it's a war crime to capture an enemy combatant? What the fuck? No, it's literally, it's not. That's like, that unironically, that unironically is one of the things that is like totally permissible. The treatment of the prisoner can